Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad, and I am glad to be here with you and with everyone here, our remarkable speakers who have taken time out of their day to join us for this really critical teach-in. My name is Bassam Haddad again. I am the host today, and I will be introducing Amahl Bishara, Dina Matar, and Adel Iskandar in just a minute. This is teach-in number 11 under the title Media and the War on Gaza. We had a teach-in yesterday on Know Your Rights, Assault on Campus Activism and Beyond, and it was stellar. I hope you can catch it, along with all the other 10 teach-ins at palestineincontext.org, where you can also listen to the War on Palestine podcast. And we are, again, a collective of 22 university institutions and research centers who are dedicated to provide knowledge production that you are not seeing or seeing less and less of on mainstream media and in mainstream spaces. Today, we are addressing essentially the media, and it's a fitting topic, especially in recent days, as a result of what we have been seeing in terms of the portrayal of what is going on. We're also not just seeing a problematic portrayal. The word even-handedness or lack of even-handedness is no longer, meaningful anymore as a critique. But we're also seeing a role that the media plays, and that role is actually reinforcing the actual policies that are causing the calamity unfolding before us, which is why this is a very important discussion. We will start with Amahl Bishara. So I would like to introduce Amahl first. But first, let me ask our speakers and guests, how are you? Kifkon?
We're okay, thank you.
Thank
Great
you
to
for
be here with you, but very sober day.
thank you for joining us, everyone. Um, Everyone will speak for about 12 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. I'm sorry that we sometimes are not able to get to audience questions because of the limited time we have. It also depends on what we end up addressing and whether the questions are going to add to them. So apologies in advance for that. Amahl Bishara is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Tufts University and an affiliated faculty of the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. She is the author of Crossing a Line, Laws, Violence, and Roadblocks to Palestinian Political Expression from Stanford in 2022, recently, Mabruk. And the other book, Backstories, U.S. News Production and Palestinian Politics, also from Stanford in 2013, an ethnography of the production of U.S. news during the Second Palestinian Intifada. Bishara's research revolves around media, settler colonialism, expressivity, and place. She also directed or co-directed, is it or and? I am. She also
One
directed
of each.
or co-directed the documentary, because it says it here and I want to make sure I'm getting it right. She also directed or co-directed the documentaries Across. I see what you're saying. I see. So there are several documentaries that I'm going to address. The documentaries are Across Oceans, Among Colleagues, Degrees of Incarceration, and Take My Pictures for Me. Working with youth at Lajee Center and in Aida refugee camp, Bethlehem, she has co-produced 2 bilingual children's books, The Boy and the Wall and the Aida Camp Alphabet. And there's a long list of other material that I will leave to place on the website where you can find all this material, and that is palestineincontext.org. And we will turn to Amahl, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bassam. I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you all and grateful for this practice of teach-ins that allows us to learn across borders, for the work of Jadaliyya. I also want to begin in a way with, I'll actually just start my own timer so I can see it here. I also want to begin with a question about how we can speak with humble recognition of the circumstances that make our speech possible and that make others less able to speak and be heard. So just to take a moment to consider, what does it mean for each of us to be able to speak and listen today? I have to drink water as I speak, and I will. But we know now that piped water in Gaza right now is salty and very, very scarce. We know that bottled water is extremely hard to find. I speak from a position of safety and relative rest when I know that my friends in the West Bank with whom I've collaborated in some of those projects that Bassam just mentioned are now going to sleep each night wondering whether they'll wake to Israeli soldiers in their homes who could beat them or take them away or beat or take away their relatives. I speak with relative job security and I'm thinking, or I speak with job security and I'm thinking of Palestinian citizens of Israel who've lost their jobs or positions at universities as students for social media posts about the unprecedented atmosphere of threat in which they live today. So as we talk about these media worlds that we're all taking part in, I think it's essential to think about these basic conditions of threat, discomfort, and insecurity in which so many Palestinians live today. And we can even think also of sort of the structural issues that condition Palestinian speech as well. But actually, I was encouraged by Adel to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in the first book, Backstories. In that book, I conceived of Palestinians as epistemic others in three ways: as Arabs during the War on Terror, with its Islamophobic underpinnings; as a stateless people working in a field of journalistic production where knowledge production is closely tied to the state through press conferences and official statistics; and also because of Orientalist prejudices about how Arabs are unable to tell, that hold that Arabs are unable to tell the truth or essentially linked to violence. So Palestinians as epistemic others, in this way, faced special challenges as journalists, even being recognized as journalists, working in US institutions and beyond. At the same time, I argued, US news works under assumptions about US American foreign correspondents as neutral figures, outside and above Palestinians and Israelis on the ground. This bestows upon US Americans the air of authority, of reasonableness. Yet we know that US journalists are not outside and above Palestine, Israel. Foreign correspondents generally come to their work with stronger cultural identifications with Jewish Israelis than with Palestinians, and not really because they are Jewish necessarily, but just because of cultural affiliations between US and Israeli society. They often come with conceptions of Palestinians that are structured by anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian racism, even if they may have begun to interrogate those structures of racism. When they arrive, foreign correspondents often live in Israeli society, and so their cultural alignment with Israel is further entrenched. Moreover, and perhaps most importantly, we know, to challenge this idea of the neutral American, we know that US Americans are hardly outside and above this context, given the billions of dollars of US aid the US gives to Israel each year. So it's really important to think about neutrality and objectivity, these words that seem to characterize the value of good journalism as claims of the powerful, claims of power, and even claims of empire in this context. In the intervening 10 years or so since I wrote this book, there have been times when it seemed that this landscape has been shifting. And I think that it has been shifting in meaningful ways. We've seen, for example, a lot of the book was about actually collaborations between US journalists and Palestinian journalists, where Palestinians were producers or fixers working with US journalists. And we've seen now how some of those roles and collaborations are accounted for with more nuance, where fixers and reporters are, given attribution. We've also seen in some major outlets more diverse reporting. Reporters who are Muslims, who are Arabs, who are Palestinians, playing more visible roles. And yet, in these new times of catastrophe, the nexus between racism, the constellation of the war on terror that authorizes state violence, and outright state violence continue to undermine Palestinians as narrators and strengthen pro-Israeli perspectives in US media. We've also seen Muslim journalists being sidelined at key moments, even on outlets like MSNBC. So to think about the expressive terrain or the media terrain on Palestine today, I think we need to look at laws, these cultural formations of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian racism, the norms of journalism, the algorithms that shape our social media worlds, and military violence itself. So that's 5 factors, and each of these 5 elements are interrelated. For example, the laws, of course, are created based on the cultural assumptions of lawmakers, right? journalists are influenced by social media algorithms because they too wake up to social media feeds that start to inform their view of the world, just as non-journalists do. Moreover, each of these 5 elements has local, national, regional, and global dimensions that interact. So, for example, what's sayable now in the United States is different than what can be said in Germany. For example, because the German parliament has said that, for example, the sort of support of a boycott of Israel is anti-Semitic. But that hasn't happened in the same way in the United States, and yet German restrictions sort of begin to impact us in the United States because of global formations of discourse and expressive freedoms. And we see, even this week, we've seen, new definitions of anti-Semitism that are shaping, what's sayable in this country. And just this week, in where I am in Massachusetts, there was a hearing about whether or not Massachusetts should adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. And one of the examples of anti-Semitism offered in relationship to that definition is, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, end quote. So, how do we square such a definition of anti-Semitism with, the research of major and important human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and many others that find that Israel is an apartheid state, right? So I think as we're looking at the media worlds in which we operate, we need to trace how definitions like this impact the space of critique of Israel around the world. We can also notice how cultural assumptions about Palestinians as being barbaric and violent have informed presidential statements and also news coverage. And I really resonate with what Bassam said at the beginning about how the media reinforces policies in this country, right? So reading just an op-ed from Nick Kristof this week, it was about that too many Palestinian children had been killed. And yet he includes in the paragraph, in the essay, the paragraph, quote, there isn't a distinction. Hamas deliberately killed and kidnapped children on October 7th. Israel is not deliberately killing Palestinian children. It is simply bombing entire neighborhoods with far too little attention to civilian life, end quote. And this kind of a distinction really resonates with an American history about the relative guilt or innocence of those who kill up close with cheap weapons versus those who kill from a distance with high tech, right? This is a very American type of argument that Kristof has made. And it resonates with the way in which the US has tried to absolve itself of guilt during the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan through its use of air power. Why does somebody like Nick Kristof give Israeli leaders the benefit of the doubt, given all of the genocidal language that's been out there from Israeli leaders? Why assume for some unknown reason that Israel is not deliberately killing Palestinian children when we have well-researched reports in outlets like 972, the article Mass Assassination Factory inside Israel's calculated bombing of Gaza, right? So I want to, I do think one of the things that also has changed in the last years has been the emergence and strengthening of outlets like 972 and Mondo Weiss Electronic Intifada. This really changes our media terrain, and also of human rights organizations with very kind of specific mandates to address digital freedoms. So an organization like Hamla, based in Haifa, that addresses social media, and these are incredible sources, and I hope we can kind of continue to hold up their work and appreciate their work. But actually, in my remaining time, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the relationship between data being produced about the Palestinian death count, state power and empire, and death or killing itself. So just going all the way back to late October, on October 24th, I never would click on a Bret Stephens headline in the New York Times, but it was the Palestinian Republic of Fear and Misinformation. So I had to click on that. So, it's an article that basically asserts that Palestinians sort of, because of their politics and political structures, they are inclined to lies or misinformation. And Israel, because it's a democracy, there's an accountability, they produce rigorous facts. I'm not going to go into a deep textual analysis there, but it's so insidious. And then the next day, President Biden on October 25th declared that he had, I quote, I have no confidence in the numbers that the Palestinians are using regarding the Palestinian death count. and I mean, to take in the skepticism over the Palestinian death count was so horrific, particularly in that it came on the very same day that we watched on Al Jazeera, as Al Jazeera journalist Wael al-Dahdouh learned of his family member's death while on air. And his commitment to truth in journalism has been such that, he's continued his commitment to his work, even in the most dreadful moments that day and beyond, right? Then the very next day after Biden's statement, the Gaza Ministry of Health produced a 200-plus page PDF of names and ages of those killed to say, we are counting, and we are counting as best as we can. Soon after that, Israel actually revised down its casualty numbers from October 7th. And I'll just quote one more time from the New York Times, which at this point said, quote, Israel's original toll from the attacks did not come under the level of scrutiny that the United States has applied to the death toll compiled by the authorities in the Gaza Strip, where thousands have died in weeks of heavy Israeli bombardment and a ground invasion. Dry language, but making a very important point that, there was no skepticism for the Israeli death count in the same way that there was for the Palestinian one. But so there's this urge to truth and reporting that has driven Palestinians, not only of these last 8 weeks, but over, years and decades. Nevertheless, when Israel and its supporters cannot silence Palestinians through those kinds of aspersions of racism, Israel does try to silence Palestinians through other means. We know that there have been at least 4 major shutdowns of internet and phone technologies. And of course, those are deadly not only for sort of the production of knowledge, but deadly literally, right, in that they would stop communications between ambulances and hospitals. So this nexus of limiting the production of information and actually killing people is something that we need to keep our eye on very carefully. We then came to late November, when finally the Gaza Ministry of Health did not update its death toll for a few days because of the direness of the collapse of the healthcare system there, right? And it began updating those numbers. But again, the intensity of the violence and death eventually meant that for a while, producing those reliable statistics was temporarily impossible. Then we come to the killings of journalists themselves. The Committee to Protect Journalists reported that the first month of this war was the deadliest month for journalists since they began recording such killings. At least 63 journalists have been killed since October 7th, 56 Palestinians, 4 Israelis, and 3 Lebanese journalists. I think so many Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been killed. One journalist was killed. Abdul Halim Awad was killed in a strike on his home. He had been working full time since the beginning of the war, and he went home to visit his family, and that is when he was killed. So we see again, Palestinian journalists face death the way that all Palestinians in Gaza are facing death right now, because it is all around them, the killings from Israeli airstrikes. But it's also important to recognize that though this is a time of a generalized threat of death and killing in Gaza, this is part of a longer pattern of Israel killing journalists. According again to a Committee to Protect Journalists report, the Israeli army has killed 20 journalists over the last 22 years. 13 of those 20 were identified as members of the media or were inside vehicles with press insignia at the time they were killed. So these are important histories to hold up and to remember. It's also important to know that over the last 2 months, the attacks on journalists and truth-telling go beyond Gaza. In the West Bank, Al Jazeera English videographer Joseph Handel was assaulted by settlers in Bethlehem. We've seen a number of journalists arrested for social media posts and for their work as journalists in the West Bank. Also, we know that journalists, including Musab Abu Taha, has arrested and beaten in Gaza as well. And Palestinian citizens of Israel also have been attacked as journalists in Israel, in the cities of Tel Aviv and in Ashkelon. So in the efforts of moving forward here, just thinking back to Biden's denial of the Palestinian death count, this is how empire works. It pays for the weapons, it legitimizes the bombings through language about terrorism and security, and then it denies the killings themselves. Bret Stephens suggested that Palestinians live in a society of lies, but we know that in fact Palestinians prize their journalists, their truth tellers, because we rely on them every day to learn about events that shape our present and our futures. We remember the tens of thousands of Palestinians who helped later arrest Shirin Abu Akleh. We remember how Israeli officers beat her pallbearers as they were carrying her, yet they still carried her to her resting place. So I think, it is our responsibility today not only to carry forward the voices of those who have fallen, but also to remember the tenacity, the bravery, and the perseverance of journalists, Palestinian journalists, and media workers who are working every day. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amahl. I would like to move now to our second speaker, Dina Matar. Dina is professor of political communication and Arab media at the Center for Global Media and Communication at SOAS University of London. She is the chair of the Center for Palestine Studies, the director of the Center for Global Media and Communication at the School of Law, and the chair of the SOAS Academic Assembly. Matar is a founding editor of the Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication and the editor of the Media, War, and Conflict Journal. Matar holds an MSc in comparative politics as well as a PhD in media and communications from the. It's telling me to stop. No, as well as um, a PhD in media and communications from the London School of Economics. She has conducted research in the Arab world, particularly Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Before coming before becoming an academic, Matar worked as a foreign correspondent covering the Middle East and then an editor working on the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. And also, يعني يخزي العين, everybody that we are introducing has a very long bio, but I will stop here and I will give the floor to Dina.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting us. And it's a very important discussion, particularly because the role of media is sometimes neglected, and particularly the role of media in conflict. Doesn't mean that you neglect other factors, but I think particularly today when you have so much media and media is embedded in our lives and we are embedded in media, we really need to pay attention to it. But I wanted to carry on a bit from what Amahl had said and to move on a bit further and talk from a paper about the right to communicate and then thinking about various issues in relation to why media narratives, particularly during war, are important to take account of. In a well-cited essay titled Permission to Narrate, written in 1984, Edward Said talked about Western media coverage and public discourse of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 as producing dominant narratives about the Palestinians as terrorists and the Israelis as merely acting out of self-defense. This narrative, he proposed, was the product of two levels of censorship. One, the silencing in the media in particular of opinions, particularly those critical of Israel, and two, the absence of a counter-narrative, meaning a narrative about the story and future of the Palestinians as they themselves see it. Today, almost 40 years since the publication, and judging by even the most cursory analysis of the Western mainstream media, official and public discourse of the genocidal Israeli assault against Palestinians in Gaza, we can say that nothing has changed, except perhaps substituting the call for permission to narrate, as I propose here, with a call for permission to communicate as a fundamental human right. Now, the right to communicate was first enunciated in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. It goes on to say, everyone should uphold others' right to communicate as they interact with people in daily life in order to enhance equality, justice, and human dignity. In this short talk, I suggest that denying the Palestinians the right to communicate is evident in three interrelated practices that have been prominent since October the 7th. First, the mainstream media practice of prioritizing the voices and narrative of Israeli officials and their supporters who have used language dehumanizing Palestinians and legitimizing Israel's strategies and plans. There are many examples, but for example, here in the BBC coverage in particular, the BBC has amplified and reproduced Israeli narratives while relying on Israeli officials and IDF sources in their reporting. There are many examples. For example, on 27th of October, when the IDF stepped up its catastrophic bombardment of Gaza, BBC Online headlines simply ran with the Israeli narrative that this was merely a question of expanding activity, instead of questioning, as others were doing, whether this was a war crime. Along with this practice, the British mainstream media also used the term pro-Palestinian to talk about protesters protesting the bombardment and the Israeli actions, as though implying that the conflict is equal, while also repeating irresponsible and violent terms promoted by the UK government that these are protests about hate rather than love for innocent women and children. For example, the Sunday Express on 5th of November had a full-page story on the anti-Israeli marches with the headline, "My Terror Over Race Hate Mobs." And we have many examples like that. Now, the second practice in terms of, this right to, kind of practices against the right to communicate is the one where the mainstream media practice of excluding the voices and narratives of ordinary Palestinians, along with the silencing of progressive voices. This has meant the deliberate silencing of voices, putting some context to the ill-thought-out October 7 Hamas attack, which combined with the above has contributed to a culture of fear and people exercising self-censorship. And of course, this comes, as Amahl had said, in a culture of increasing fear about speaking up and worrying about what's going to happen if you do. The third practice is persistent Israeli war and discursive practices aimed at, Israeli practice of disconnecting communication networks and access to the outside world on many occasions. And these really were, if you kind of look back at the occasions when communications just stopped, they were the prelude to a serious Israeli bombardment. So somehow you begin to understand that, okay, this is why they are disconnecting. But then, of course, this is a practice that is denying the right to communicate, to talk to people, to kind of tell people what's happening to you. And along with this practice, along with the practice of denying Palestinians the right to communicate, there's also the practice of, the killing of entire families together, which in other words, which is another very important aspect of this, genocide, is what we can talk about as memoricide, which is killing memory, the practice of killing Palestinian memory, which again, the right to memory is a human right. So here I propose that these practices combined have produced a disciplinary, indeed a punitive communications apparatus that functions as an extension of Israel's propaganda machine, Hasbara, and that continues to construct Palestine and Palestinians as an exception, or the discourse as anti-Palestinian racism, which has taken hold in Western imagination through its communication and repetition. Now, some might say there has been a slight shift in the tone and the language in the past few weeks, particularly in the mainstream Western media. And here we're talking about the media that reaches to or is read by the elite, by the political elite, but also by a large proportion of the society. So some would say that there might have been a shift, but with looking with hindsight to critical media scholarship, has shown that first framing, this concept of first framing, the first frame, the first language and narrative of any event, particularly in international news, matters. This is because international news, even in the digital age, continues to be dominated by the major international news media organizations with a quasi-monopoly for providing prime explanations of breaking news in the world periphery. First frames become normalized, particularly when frames are constructed from and embodied in keywords, metaphors, concepts, symbols, and visual images that are emphasized in a news narrative. It is also important to acknowledge that this war, as most recent wars, has played out in social media, mostly as a war over narrative, legitimacy, identity, and rights. Unlike past genocidal wars, however, The merciless attacks against civilians by Israel have been played out and been witnessed in detail on social media and other platforms. Past genocides, each uniquely horrific in its own ways, occurred when modes of communication were different, distances vast, and killings occurred out of sight of most people who would shrug their shoulders with indifference. Time and future research will tell whether and how these battles over narrative, human rights, and legitimacy might have influenced public opinion. But based on available research, there is no conclusive evidence of a shift in public opinion as a result of the mediation of atrocities and the visibility of these atrocities in raw form in social media platforms. Indeed, a poll conducted by Sky News 5 weeks following the beginning of the war found that there was no change in public opinions amongst people aged 50 and above. Those who supported Israel continue to support Israel. They did not change their viewpoint. But what was interesting was that the poll found that 75% of people under the age of 40, the younger generation, were more supportive of Palestinians. So, maybe that we could say there is a role of social media here, that they are exposed to different voices, and maybe they are more activist, more progressive in their thinkings. So media scholarship is interesting to go back to and think about and think how to explain what is happening. But to comprehensively discuss the multiple debates around the constructed exceptionality of Palestine and the Palestinians, as particularly in in the media, is beyond the remit of this intervention. But what most scholars agree on is that media are to a certain extent implicated in the ways we come to understand the world as a web of narratives in which power and knowledge, as Michel Foucault has argued, are part of one system. Going back to my claim at the beginning, which is the claim of denying the right to communicate, the visibility of the genocidal war that we see, along with the denial of the right to communicate to ordinary people, pose a moral question and ethical dilemma for journalists and media outlets covering the war, and for us, scholars and intellectuals working in media and communication. This means that we as practitioners and scholars must always take account of the complex factors and facts and the historical context that have influenced media framing for more than 7 decades since the first Nakba, including the malevolent Israeli political communication strategy that constructs Israel as a democracy with the right to exist and defend itself at whatever cost. The most pernicious frame in this strategy is the anti-Semitic frame that haunts all supporters of Palestine, academic freedom, and more dangerously, the right to communicate the historical context of 75 years of settler colonial Israeli practices, ethnic cleansing, and repression of the Palestinians in everyday life. In recent years, Israeli propaganda had, until October 7th, pushed for the definition of anti-Semitism in the Western world to be expanded to include criticism of the Israeli state and questioning the moral basis of Zionism. Now there is fear that even contextualizing and historicizing the war and its outcome could also trigger accusations of anti-Semitism. So what is also worrying, though, is the denial of right to communicate and the right to memory for ordinary Palestinians, which I don't have time to talk about. This is a severe setback for the field of oral history and popular memory, which I have been involved with. And I just feel, kind of whole families killed together, you lose the social history, the social records, and so on. And we have to take account into that. And the media has not covered that, sadly, except, in snippets here and there. As scholars, teachers, activists, and researchers in the media, at this very bleakest moment for Palestinians, we are obliged to ask what Gaza can tell us about meta moments of history, mediated history in this sense, that continue to shape what it means to be Palestinian, to be human. Even in the incredible monstrous attacks that wipe out whole families, we see images of people practically in rags, helping each other, cooking together, sharing mattresses, and helping the wounded and the bereaved, underlining the Palestinians' will to life and to survive, even as destruction is waged on the streets and on buildings. It is within these contexts that are exceptional and in an existential sense that we can look at Gaza as a site through which, as Palestinian poet Rafif Ziadi said, "We teach you life, sir," and through which being Palestinian becomes the disruptor of dominant narrative that will Palestinians not to exist and vanish somewhere else. I end with a segment from Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. In his poet Silence for Gaza, he wrote, I quote, Gaza equals the history of an entire homeland because it is more ugly, impoverished, miserable, and vicious in the eyes of the enemies, because it is the most capable among us of disturbing the enemy's mood and his comfort, because it is his nightmare, because it is mined oranges, children without a childhood, old men without old age, and women without desires. Because of all this, it is the most beautiful, purest, and richest among us, and the one most worthy of love. I'm open to questions about media later on, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dina, for this second illuminating intervention. We will move to Adel. Um, Adel is a longtime friend and partner in crime in so many of the projects that we are working on. I will introduce Adil, although also Adil has a modest bio here compared to his real bio. Adil is an associate professor of global communication and director of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, CCMS, at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. He is the author, co-author, and editor of several works, including Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution, Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism. Very important book. Edward Said, A Legacy of Emancipation and Representation, and Mediating the Arab Uprisings, which I had the pleasure of co editing with Adil, and Media Evolution and the Eve of the Arab Spring. Iskandar's work deals with media, identity, and politics, and he has lectured extensively on these topics at universities worldwide. He is a co-editor of Jadaliyya. Adil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bassam. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. I have to say it's a very, very difficult and very jarring moment to be talking about this. I want to first start off by saying that I'm joining you today from the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, Coast Salish communities that were erased and effaced and continue to be forgotten here in the western part of Turtle Island, the nation state that we call Canada. And I say this because I think it's important to recognize that not only are these discussions of indigeneity, belonging, and repatriation really critical to our understanding of what's happening in Gaza, as over 1 million people are displaced after having been displaced from their original towns and villages elsewhere across historic Palestine. So it's important to know that belonging is part of memory, and remembering belonging is something that is connected and a source of solidarity across boundaries and oceans. I will also say that in relation to the media, those acknowledgments are ones that are rarely evoked in any functional or substantial way. It is largely because the way in which mainstream media in North America and Western Europe had and have from time immemorial committed themselves to colonial projects and imperial adventure. And so to imagine that they, in this moment, will decide to shift their approaches in any functional manner to challenge or undermine these colonial projects would be very naive. I want to say that I thank Amahl for recognizing the privilege that we possess. Not only do we have voices as educators and researchers, but in many instances as presumed or articulated experts in our respective fields, we're often invited to offer commentary about the current situations in the face of the continuous demonization and invisibility of Palestinians. We must use the few avenues and opportunities for intervention in this incredible media blackout against Palestinians and pro-Palestinian voices to be able to push back. So this discussion, I think, is connected to that. I want to speak today on the various institutional barriers to covering Palestine and Palestinians, and a lot of this dovetails with both Amahl and Dina's presentations. The first thing I want to say is that if this conversation were to be having, you know, 5, 10, 15 years ago, it would be a different arrangement, because one of the things that we've witnessed thus, in the last decade has been substantial shifts in global power in terms of media distribution and production. Today, we have countries in the global south that have their own national, state-run and private media enterprises that are currently producing content that reflects their local ambitions, their political projects, and how they see the world. In no small measure, one could argue that Al Jazeera is one such operation, and so when we think about U.S. media or North American media or Western European media, it's critical to note that there are news organizations around the world that are deeply funded with billions of dollars worth of investment in their operations, in their outreach, um, in their sort of presence on the ground, that are shifting the way in which the world sees the Palestinian Israeli conflict and what is happening in Gaza. So while our discussion today is about North America, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And Al Jazeera is by no means the only institution of its sort, nor the only one communicating out of or producing content out of the Middle East. I want to focus my comments about this notion of propaganda. For the most part, when we think about the notion of propaganda, we assume that it has everything to do with the nemesis, or sort of we have this view of sort of Nazi and fascist propaganda. That is, of course, the most classic example of propaganda. But arguably, one could go back to the period of the Second World War and the immediate period thereafter, to see how institutions within the United States and the UK weren't using euphemistic terms like public diplomacy or public or political advocacy. They were using the word propaganda to describe their operations and what they had to do. At the time, the military objectives of the state were very much tied to what the state was trying to accomplish. BBC World Service, then called Empire Radio, was committed to its imperial ambitions, and the same is true with state or government-run broadcasting in the United States. Now, in countries that are centralized, we understand that the media systems there are, and of course, centralized media that are state-run are few and far between. And we usually describe those as propagandistic, and we're very dismissive of those. But in the case of countries with private or corporate media systems, the propaganda models are actually much more nuanced and sophisticated. So I want to draw our attention to the way in which the US, for example, or other Western media landscapes operate, and how that proliferates and continues to produce propagandized content. The first is the major problem of size, ownership, and profit orientation. First, when we look at the level of media ownership and conglomerization, media organizations in the United States, or I should say, like all media operations in the U.S., are run by 6 companies, and by that I mean 90% or more, run by 6 companies. The largest media conglomerate in the United States now is Comcast, with an annual revenue of $121 billion. To round the top companies, we've got AT&T, Meta, Disney, Warner Brothers, Netflix, Paramount, and Fox. And of course, when we describe those, we're not even mentioning the incredible number of subsidiaries and sub-subsidiaries of those companies, which include a massive amount of content production that covers the entire country and also has a substantial footprint internationally. Besides public broadcasters like NPR and PBS and other independent alternative platforms and networks, those are minuscule in contrast to those companies. So those companies actually are in a position to articulate, describe, and position news coverage about what is happening in Gaza right now. And because of the centralization, it means that their offices, whether it's their business offices or their news offices, are sometimes shared and amalgamated as content is distributed across their various subsidiaries. And I leave it to the rest, to everybody here who's listening, to explore what that means as far as the democratization of information, not just on Palestine, but almost every other aspect of public life. The second is the extent to which advertising licenses do business with those companies. Most of these companies have built-in advertisers as subsidiaries within their conglomeration. That means that to advertise any product on any of these news networks, there needs to be a vertical and horizontal agreement that the advertising offices cannot be undermined by the news coverage that may be critical of those advertising companies and the products that they have built into them. And then, of course, you could see how that entails connections to the military industrial complex, corporations that are invested in Israeli arms, and the way in which news is covered around Palestine, Israel. The third is sourcing of mass media news. Because news, every one of those companies has a built-in news organization as a subsidiary, these news organizations are not independent of the business offices because they are implicated if they criticize advertisers. And of course, it also means that the reporters are on, they're on the payroll of those large sort of entertainment companies. Now, of course, every one of those conglomerates has connected to it a major entertainment production line as well. So you could see from the outset that what we're looking at is a growing journalistic dichotomy. So, what is good business and what is good news? And is good news good business? And is good business good news? When it comes to the Palestinians and dealing with Palestinian dynamics, when we zoom in on the way in which news is produced, as most of us would understand, journalistic dichotomies and journalistic principles attest to the importance of having two sources for any major story. Now, of course, if one of the sources is described as Hamas, and you'll see that in almost all of the reporting coming out of the United States and many other Western mainstream news organizations, Hamas is considered and described as a terrorist organization. And the word Hamas is involved and included in every assessment and every reference to Palestinianness in Gaza. Whether it's a hospital, it's a Hamas-run hospital. If it's a school, it's a Hamas-run school. If it's a university, it's a Hamas-run university. That sleight of hand and that sort of discursive move is one that equates Hamas, any of those institutions, with terrorism. So if Hamas equals terrorism, and of course, in many instances, we see the indistinguishability and the lack of differentiation between Palestinians and Hamas. Then, by definition, most Palestinians then become terrorists. Where that becomes immensely problematic is when a reporter or a news article or a news package is being produced, and they're looking for that second part or second source for the story. If the alternative to the Israeli production is a Palestinian or a Palestinian voice or news coming from Palestine, then by definition, it needs to be disentangled from that characterization of being inherently terrorist. So, in the same way that there is never a Palestinian partner for peace, there's also no Palestinian civilians, there are no Palestinian non terrorists. Therefore, the only acceptable Palestinian, unfortunately, is a dead one. And even with Palestinian dead, once they are dead, they are typically forgotten. Their stories don't need to be told. And so one never needs to revisit that. A fourth characteristic, when instances where the news media are not conforming because of the profit-driven, imperatives, or they're not, listening because of the advertising licenses, and there are sort of breakthroughs in reporting that are critical of Israel's coverage. We see the way FLAC and enforcement works. So whether it's watchdog journalism, the organizations like Camera and the euphemistically titled Honest Reporting and others, their job is to essentially it has, of course, they articulate their operations as focusing on accuracy in reporting, but more likely or more often it is about maintaining a political line. This involves intimidation, labeling, threats, and also threats specifically to long-term impact on advertising for those media networks. And we see that happen across the board. Any report coming out that is in any way sympathetic to Palestinian suffering or loss is immediately the target of various campaigns driven by those organizations. The most hefty and most egregious form of flack is either firing or silencing of reporters or intimidation or rendering them vulnerable or precarious in some way, shape, or form. And that, of course, happens extensively. And there's so many examples of that that I don't need to cover here. But of course, there's also the actual physical harm that is caused to journalists. Now, Gaza is, as Amal mentioned, is effectively the deadliest and most dangerous place to be reporting as a journalist, which means that any journalist prepared to take a risk of covering from Gaza, they are essentially, rendering themselves not only a viable target for Israeli attacks, but that the story itself can't come out unless it's reported by people who have lost the hope of living, which is a very unfortunate dynamic. Now, we see the flack and enforcement also precipitate in the social media platforms where reporting or folks who are producing content from Gaza or about Gaza or proliferating content from Gaza are being shadow banned, which means that the social media platforms develop sort of structural mechanisms to ensure that their posts are not seen. Many of us have witnessed that and know how that is when you share something and you typically get a certain level of engagement, but a post basically disappears. People find ways around that, but you can see how flack and enforcement has varying degrees of both effectiveness and veracity. And then the fifth is what Chomsky and Herman would describe as like anti-communist or war on terror kind of dimensions, which is a drastic escalation in the way in which conformity and propaganda work in media systems in corporate media systems. And I would say that while the war on terror and the aftermath of 9/11 gives us a really clear example of how approaches to silencing media criticism of military operations works, we can see that grafted almost whole cloth to the Israeli attack on Gaza. I would argue that it's even further than that. Israel wars on Gaza, while it's tied into that, it is actually Israel's entire existence that is wrapped up in a war on terror narrative. There's never a circumstance where Israel is not actively engaged in a war on terror against, some nemesis or some adversary or another. Even innocent civilians living in the West Bank under an apartheid system are sleeper cells. Everybody is a threat. And so if Israel is constituted as an ally in a war on terror, anything and everything that it does is therefore forgiven and deemed acceptable. Where there is a challenge to that is in the digital and social media, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes kind of talking about that. While digital media or companies are still very much governed by the same patterns of conglomeration that I described previously, democratizing their content and distribution has been really substantial in this particular conflict. It has a lot to do with the ubiquity of cameras and equipment inside Gaza, even though there are blackouts and shortages and internet interruptions being done by Israel for obvious reasons. People finding ways around it, either through satellite uplinks or eSIM cards and things of that sort, have found a way to distribute content beyond the natural boundaries of how information is distributed. So for some of these changes are in fact positive because they're able to bypass the broadcast media's official pathways. If all of these restrictions exist, the social media content coming out of Gaza is very impactful. It's also being proliferated and amplified by users outside who are seeing this and distributing it. There is, of course, built-in structural algorithmic biases that target specific users, that ban specific content, that question the viability and the veracity of the content. But nevertheless, because of the scale of distribution and the depth of the content, and also the fact that a lot of this content is produced real time and live with very limited editing, it's very difficult to control that. The other point that I wanted to make is with regards to the kind of depictions, because of what's coming out of social media producers in Gaza and elsewhere, we finally see a real challenge to the gender depictions of dead Palestinians, even though the West's mainstream media are obsessed with, or not obsessed with, they're actually not even remotely interested in Palestinian death, but at the very least they have a hard time with the fatalities among women, children, and babies, and the complete sort of dismissal of male bodies. The discussions happening and the content being produced from Gaza, including the most recent images of men who have been stripped down to their underwear and lined up and blindfolded in front of Israeli soldiers. A lot of this content begs the question of whether or not the gendered bodies of Palestinians can be produced in such a way so as to dismiss the humanity of men, and I think that's a really key issue. Um, in 2015, for those who remember that long, unfortunately, that many conflicts between then and now, a young Syrian boy whose body washed up on the Turkish shores called Alan Kurdi, the image of that little boy precipitated the mass mobilization of publics and also pressure on governments in Europe to shift their policy vis-a-vis immigration for Syrian refugees. The videos and photos coming out of Gaza are absolutely gut wrenching and harrowing. Of course, there are literally thousands of Alan Kurdis and thousands of photos documenting similar, horrors, some of which is impossible to watch. And yet, most of this content doesn't make its way into the mainstream media, and a lot of that is not by coincidence. But having said that, today's citizen journalists in Gaza, like Mu'taz Azeza, who has 16.6 million followers on Instagram, Plestia Al-Aqad with 4.3 million followers, and Bisan with 3.3 million followers. And this is just to name the three most popular. The impact of the content that they're producing is rendering a lot of the stories coming out of Gaza relatable and real for publics around the world. Just by way of comparison, the IDF's official English language account has 1.3 million followers. So just by looking at this, we could see that the real contrast here is with regards to which generations are accessing which platforms for what reason and what information they're seeking out and how they're redistributing it. The IDF relies almost entirely on either embedded reporting, the State of Israel's official distribution lines, and their connections to Zionist communities. Sorry, Bassam. خلاص هانت. And then the last thing that I want to say is that in 2010, vegetable vendor Mohammed Bouazizi self-immolated in front of the government building in Sidi Bouzid, and of course triggered what we now call the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring, heralded and celebrated in Western media as a democratizing movement. In Atlanta, Georgia, just a few days ago on December 1st, a pro-Palestinian protester self-immolated as well in protest, and the response has been absolutely nothing. Very limited reporting. The only quotes in the Reuters report on this was that from the police chief was, "We believe the building remains safe and we do not see any threat here." What's worse is the consul general of Israel to the southeastern United States, who happens to work in that office, said, "We are saddened to learn of the self-immolation at the entrance of the office building. It is tragic to see the hate and incitement towards Israel expressed in such a horrific way. The sanctity of life is our highest value." So even in self-inflicted injury, as an act of protest, a pro-Palestinian voice is threatening to Israel. In fact, becoming an ally of Israel, of an ally of Palestinian rights, can itself render oneself indispensable. And many of us remember the story of Rachel Corrie in 2003, who was bulldozered by an Israeli bulldozer who was trying to destroy Palestinian homes in the West Bank. Today, if one were to do a scouring, if one were to scour the media at the time in 2003 to see how many reports on Rachel Corrie are there, you will find a scant 3 reports, which is a reminder that even American citizens who are in solidarity with Palestinians are equally dispensable as Palestinians themselves. Thank you.
Sorry.
I surprised
Thank
you by
Thank you. No, I was pushing buttons, but I had it on something called preview mode that prevents problems. But then another one occurred. All right. So I really appreciate this, and I know that so many people do. Your presentations and interventions are critical, and they actually will inform what we are going to observe, not just what we have observed already. And because we are a bit tight on time, I had usually, as I've shared before, said that we'd go for 75 to 90 minutes. So we'll try to, as much as possible, cover some questions. I have my own questions, and there are a couple of questions that I have received directly and indirectly online. But I'll start with Amal, if that's okay. So Amal, we are all witnessing, especially in the United States, but I'm sure elsewhere as well, like the UK and Germany, which is off the charts. Apparently, what's happening in Germany, and it's not a huge puzzle why. However, in the United States, we see that so many people in the media are afraid to cover the question of Palestinian suffering. And they are concerned or weary or cautious because they don't want that weaponized label of anti-Semitism to be imposed on them or to be accused of it. So how is this impacting the reporting? So we know that the reporting is from the standpoint of what reporting should be and what the media should be doing and what their role should be. We know it's extremely problematic and frankly beyond. But how does this additional fear, how is it affecting reporting? And do you see any variation in time in the past 63 days across time?
I
You,
cannot hear.
you are muted, Azizti.
Thank you.
I was
Yeah.
muted when I told you you're muted, so the first time you couldn't hear me.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we need to find ways to tackle anti-Semitism and do teaching about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racisms and other racisms and how they're interconnected. And I think we don't do those things enough already. Like we need courses that look at these histories and how they're entangled, and so that people can identify these forms of racism as they impact people. And then we also need to be able to teach people about the difference between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. And I think we need to have these messages as clearly as possible out there for journalists as well. I think journalists don't want, as you were saying, as folks were saying, do not want to encounter being criticized publicly, or as our university presidents have been this week, called to testify about these issues. Like, I think there's an avoidance, and the avoidance leads to caution and conservatism, right? It can limit what kinds of images people use. It can limit what kinds of words people use. Once again, I think unfortunately, sort of the scale of Israeli violence is such that more Israeli violence is being covered now, right? How many Palestinians had to be killed before, that was going to be, receiving adequate coverage? or something, any kind of coverage, really, serious coverage in U.S. media. So yeah, it absolutely structures coverage. It's hard to sort of give it a gauge over the weeks, but I think what we need is, we need to be doing more education and outreach about these interrelated forms of racism and the categorical differences between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism to forestall these kinds of criticisms.
Absolutely. And before I move to a question for Dina, Adel or Dina, would you like to address this, um, especially that this is probably ubiquitous?
Well, I think some journalists are beginning to feel that they have to cover it. So we see more coverage or more coverage of Palestinian suffering than before, and that is what we see. But then again, immediately after, it is countered by a story that gives the pro-Israel viewpoint. So it's almost like justifying. There is this process of justification for everything they do. I want to mention something that we didn't touch on, which is that the fact that Western correspondents or international correspondents have not been allowed into Gaza. So the only journalists who are covering are the Palestinian journalists, and they are the journalists who are being killed. And so it is problematic. So there is no not Palestinians can. It's fantastic that they are able to talk about their story, but then they always say, there's always this suspicion that comes through, is that, yeah, they're biased or whatever. But Western journalists have so far not been allowed to go in except with the Israeli army. So they are only witnessing, very manicured um, things that the IDF wants them to see.
Can I add something really quick? I think thank you, Dina and Ahmed, for that. I would add that the other problem too is the assumption that any voice that is critical of Israel is automatically quote unquote biased. So even the most seasoned and reputable reporters, anchors, and hosts on some of the main sort of network television stations are either seeing their time reduced or having their shows canceled or being intimidated in various ways. Anyone who is either familiar or steeped in knowledge of the region is considered a non-expert when it comes to Palestine. They are important when they're covering anything else, but when it comes to Palestinian kind of loss of life, they're definitely not acceptable. And this is a source of tremendous concern because for the most part, if you are a Zionist or a reporter with Zionist leanings, you can climb up the food chain within the media and journalism enterprise quite swiftly. One really clear example is Wolf Blitzer, basically the go-to person on any conflict for CNN, and he is someone who was the editor of the official publication for AIPAC, Israel's top lobby in the United States in the 70s, and has very strong and unambiguous and really very he's very proud of the connections that he has both to Israel's political elite and to the lobby inside the United States. No one has ever questioned it. No one has ever challenged his political allegiances or argued that there's a lack of objectivity in his coverage. So I think there's an incredible double standard in that regard. But having said that, I think that that shell is starting to break in some regards because the even folks that you expect to be quite dismissive of Palestinian narratives and Palestinian loss of life are starting to be impacted. And I have to say that it also has a lot to do with audiences. Keep in mind that like corporate media are driven by their bottom line and it's about profit. And so when they see the numbers from pollsters like Gallup and others, not just about politics, but about the communities that we're talking about, it sends them in shivers because they have to contemplate the kind of audiences that are watching and why people are turning to social media. It's also about virality, like what content travels. So if millions of people are watching the content coming out of Gaza and redistributing it, corporate media look at this as potential opportunities for redistribution. So I think we're in this really tectonic moment But it's hard to tell which way it's going to go because unfortunately the infrastructure that Amahl, Dina, and myself have described has been the status quo literally for decades. So it's hard to see that being pushed against.
Thank you, Adil. I'd like to ask Dina a question. Given that you were a former journalist, or you probably are also a journalist now in your many capacities, how is the coverage in the UK and in the West in general of this particular attack on Gaza different from previous ones, or how similar it is in terms of how it's being covered in the media? I mean, we kind of, I mean, it's more intense. And are we just seeing a more intense, problematic portrayal, or is it also a difference in kind, not just degree?
I think there is difference in terms of the visuality. So that is the key difference. So and there is, the image. The images are very visual, and they are very, they're all over the place. So that is the difference. But I would argue that in terms of content and discourse, if we think about mainstream Western media coverage, the language and the coverage it remains the same. There is no change. It continues to be the same kind of story, the same narrative, and the same mantra that Israel has the right to defend itself, and then kind of um, uh, painting the Palestinians with the language that is used to talk about Palestinians is problematic and has always been problematic. So I don't see a difference in that. I want to comment a little bit more on Adel's point about social media, and of course the fact that we do have new actors here, and including people from Gaza who have been writing and telling us their stories, and these have been really very important. It's been a very important citizen journalist contribution that we shouldn't ignore. Now the question is it making a difference? And this is where I would say that it's very difficult to see whether media coverage changing this way or the other, or whether social media engagement and so on has changed public opinion, whether it is changing public opinion or changing policies. I do not see that. I see some, there are movements, obviously, and there are more people going out on the streets, more people demonstrating, more people being active, and so on. But it isn't, the relationship with politics is still very dubious, and it doesn't really make any effect on policy making. So, but the problem with media is that it can normalize a particular discourse. So the discourse about Hamas as a terrorist organization, normalize the discourse around, Palestinians as being different, which is part of this anti-Palestinian racist language that we have had since the Nakba. So this is the second Nakba. And I think, words like that are beginning to get into the mainstream media. But I go back to what I said at the beginning, is that the first framing really matters. The first frame of an event, what are the discourses, and who says that? And Adel did mention how journalists, function, because you tend to rely on official sources. You tend to want to have that type of credibility and legitimacy for your story to be accepted as being okay and as being factual. So the question is that I cannot answer, and we probably cannot answer now, is whether the changes in media consumption, media production, given the fact that we have more citizen journalists, we have a lot of engagement with social media, is that changing? And I want to say something in relation to this, is that what tends to happen is that people tend to tend to read people that they like. So this is the idea of the echo chambers, and that is pernicious in its own way. So you don't reach out outside your circle.
Thanks, Dina. Amal or Adil, do you want to comment on whether you see a difference in terms of uh, how the media have covered this war, or are you satisfied? Yes, go ahead.
I could just add one quick thing, which is to say, I think that Dina's point that, international foreign correspondents are not in Gaza right now. And that's something that, Israel has been keeping journalists out of Gaza. I mean, during these attacks on Gaza, but also, of course, for over a decade, right, and longer, right. You consider the layers and forms of blockade on Gaza, and so it's this structural exclusion of outsiders that limits journalists' understanding of Palestinian society and Gaza in general, right? They don't know the city, they don't know the places, and it leads to a lack of, generally speaking, a lack of familiarity, depth, affection for place that colors how the attack is covered, how these wars are covered. And the other, structural, if one structural thing is blockade that kind of configures how this is covered, the other is of course occupation, which is undercovered in the in U.S. journalism, and and always has been. So the continued Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank as sort of actually the underlying sort of legal structure that we should all be paying attention to, right? That Israel, in fact, can't carry out a war, as Francesca Albanese has said. Israel cannot carry out a war of self-defense against a territory that it is occupying. This is a very fundamental thing, and yet, you don't hear that mentioned very much, right? Instead, we get this Israel-Hamas war, where as though Hamas is separate from all the rest of Palestine, and as though also Israel is, that Hamas and Israel are like two similarly kinds of units that can wage a war on each other. So I think that there's been that structure in the past, but it becomes more and more important to kind of restate it, and we have that language from international human rights scholars, and so journalists need to be responsible for amplifying it.
Adil, do you want to add anything?
Yes, this
عاوز
is
تضيف؟
really, yeah. Yeah.
عاوز تضيف؟
I was like, Anadif. Okay. I think actually, I think the point about foreign correspondency is really critical on so many levels, because on one level, if Palestinians cannot be entrusted to tell their own stories, there is a racialized necessity for there to be a foreigner inside Gaza to tell the story for themselves. So, and I think that presumed bias is one that drives interest in the presence of the Ben Wiedemans, the Jeremy Bowens, the Lise Doucets, the Christiana Manpours. That these people need to be on the ground for the story to be taken seriously, because nobody from that region, you can't be native or indigenous to that place and tell your own story. And that is an issue that is not afforded to almost any other population anywhere else in the world. It is. I think it's presumably and largely very unique to Palestinians. But having said that, the silver lining is the fact that on social media, publics writ large are actually looking at these dynamics and seeing right through them. They are actually very much compelled and interested in hearing Palestinians tell their own stories. And I think that is a critical hinge issue because of the authenticity of the stories, how grounded they are. The people are able to see the streets, the towns, the refugee camps, how they've been destroyed, the infrastructure, people escaping. So all of those visuals are allowing people to finally relate. The fact that these visuals are not on mainstream media begs the question of whether or not there is a concerted effort to not produce this content. And of course, we hear the Israeli officials literally call the producers of this content propagandists. Literally, they're calling the people that we describe who are producing this content from Gaza. They're calling them Hamas propagandists. So, an attempt to dismiss them. And I think there is almost like a loss of trust that's developing between publics and media organizations if what they're producing is very much cognitively dissonant from what people are watching. And I would argue that, in fact, mainstream media is becoming increasingly obsolete anyway. unless they're able to produce packages that travel, video packages that travel extensively online and pick up significant viewers, they are largely being left to the wayside. Um, I would also say that what we haven't discussed are the solidarity movements and the influencers online who are amplifying these messages. Many of those folks, non-Arab, non-Muslim, non-Palestinian, they're from all walks of life. They're individuals who actually, many of whom are being politicized now. Some of them had never posted a single thing on any political issue. It was like food, cats, and cosmetics, and then now it's like Gaza, 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 and there's that those are um, difficult to bring down or shut down
Oh,
because of the impact and distribution.
shukran. Thank you, Adel. Thanks, everyone. A question for you, Adel, and also everyone can chime in. How does the nature of the media system impact how it covers the war in Gaza? Is it mostly about politics, ideology, economic interests, social values, cultural values? What is the impact of the nature of the media system here?
Yeah,
Almost irrespective of this particular incident, but also how does it apply to it or particular conflict?
I think for this will be interesting for people who are listening to us from different parts of the world or different areas, because they can see how what we're describing manifests specifically in their respective region. So as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, we're familiar with state-owned media where there's a very sort of clear connection between the state policy and what is being broadcast. We're also familiar with public broadcasting and the connection to either taxpayers or license payers or what have you, where there's accountability on the part of publics. But where the corporate media, things get a little bit more complicated because the decision making, the sort of the central nervous system of the corporate media system is actually neither in the state operation specifically, nor is it in the public realm where we can negotiate and discuss it and contest it. In essence, the problem becomes largely about trying to figure out where those smoke screens are. Who's taking decisions to broadcast what for what reason, to what end? And unless we look at profit, revenue, who's making money off of these organizations for what reason, how they're advocating for some at the expense of others, this is, I think, the bottom line. So we need to call into question advertisers, major media companies, and figure out what the connections to investment are, because many of those companies, as I mentioned, have massive investment portfolios, have huge advertisers that are working directly with the government of Israel and military contractors that are benefiting from the war as it stands. So I think each community, solidaristic community, needs to figure out their own connection to those spaces and begin to challenge them. The sort of the instinctive, decision has to do with confronting the media. If flack is coming from these sort of watchdog organizations that are serving Israeli and Zionist interests, then those who wish to challenge it must also do the same thing. Call into question reporting when it's fraudulent, when it's problematic, when it's advocating for war. There's news coming out right now that the U.S. Vetoed the UN resolution calling UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, and it's the only vote against it. So, what does that mean for how the media is going to cover this? Like when the U.S. looks so incredibly isolated, even allies of the United States, like the United Arab Emirates, and a country that just recently signed the Abraham Accords, and is one that has been very, very soft spoken on this campaign, was the country that brought the resolution forward. What does it look like in the US media in the aftermath of this decision? How can it be articulated as meaningful? And so we need to do this hard work, both as scholars and as members of the public, to figure out, you know, where is it that the media is failing us? In this case, in a private media system, it's failing us as consumers of a product. Like, I don't like my product. It's kind of like a customer service thing. I hate my product. It's not doing me any good. In a public broadcast system, actually, this is my taxpayer money. in a state media system, then it's like, does this democratically reflect my convictions? So I think depending on the media system, we have opportunities to interfere and push back.
Can I say something very quickly? And this goes back, obviously, to the role of the media, because um, there are these kind of normative functions of the media that it's supposed to hold government accountable. So it'll be very interesting to see how the media are going to report this, and whether there is going to be any pushback or any commentaries and so on. But also, I think Adel is very right to emphasize social media and the influencers and the podcasts and new voices coming up. And because these are the future, they are, they are helping people formulate an opinion that is different to the way that their parents or grandparents formulated an opinion. And somehow they might help them get over this, get over the fear of being the odd person out. So there is a problem around people voicing their opinion, which is that people don't speak because they worry about people out there thinking against them. So that is something to be researched, and for scholars out there to begin to think of the changes in relation to your question, Bassam, the changes around media consumption, media production. What does it mean? Who is producing, who is saying, and so on.
Amal, would you like to address this at all?
Yeah, just briefly to say that I think for me, it is really interesting to think about the contrast between mainstream media and social media as spaces for creating certain kinds of publics or spaces that presume certain kind of publics. So mainstream media as usually imagining a national public, or sometimes smaller publics within the national public, right? Is particularly in the United States, and Al Jazeera is obviously an interesting setting aside satellite stations like Al Jazeera and so forth. But, taking the frame of the state, imagining a national public that assumes its interests are a particular thing, right? But then also taking the frame of the state in terms of, how it deals with Israel and Israel's self-definition of itself as a democracy within particular bounds that ignore, its occupation, for example, right? And the way that social media then creates completely different kinds of publics, right? That are about people looking at media produced by young people half the world away who they will most likely never meet, right? What kinds of publics and creations are collectivities are created through those actions of viewing? I think is something that we can really continue to ask. And they're not isolated from each other, of course. Those worlds do interact for a number of reasons. I think we can think about also sort of the kinds of emotions that are allowed in media as well. I don't know. I was thinking a little bit more about poetry and how Dina brought in poetry to our conversation here, and I was thinking about the poetry of Rafat al-Ar'ir today, who was martyred yesterday in an Israeli airstrike as a poet. And what would it mean to bring his words? We see his words now. I see his words all over my Facebook feed, for example, and all over Twitter. What would it mean to have his poetry, appear in large U.S. Media outlets, to bring his presence and his voice, and the idea that poetry itself may be actually one of the only ways to capture, or one very, very distinctive way of capturing what we're losing, and how people experience this dreadful war.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to share a question that we received from the audience. I know that we are about to wrap up, but this is actually quite practical, so I would like to get your opinion. The person asks, I'm not going to read their handle. Do you have any suggestions for young journalists who want to cover this topic on their campuses and communities? Given that this is dangerous, how would you, as media experts, advise somebody who wants to cover these developments honestly? How do you navigate what you are seeing the values that supposedly everyone believes in except for Palestine when it comes to Palestine. And how do you do this in such a way where, there are people that, for instance, that are called swing voters who are sort of on the fence that you want to sort of, communicate to as well, but without compromising very basic things that we now find ourselves, negotiating in our heads before we say something, even if it were something that was totally okay to say in the past, and now it's criminalized. So how do you advise somebody, a young journalist at a university, who wishes to address these developments? So let's start with Amal and then go to Dina and then Adil, if you
What
don't
a
mind.
great question. Well, I guess for one thing, you're doing the right thing by one great step is to be, connecting to Jadaliyya's work in many possible media. Another thing I think is, connecting to local activists for a number of reasons. First of all, because local politics matter a lot. Like I said, there was a Massachusetts hearing on whether or not Massachusetts will take on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Like that kind of a decision will shape what goes on at our campuses, right? So looking to local politics and how it interfaces with these global issues, looking to campus politics also. I know that, for example, I only learned about my Tufts University Police Department went on a trip to Israel to learn. I still have not completely figured out crowd control. I'm not sure checkpoint management from Israeli police and military officials, right? Several years back now. And how did I learn about it? Through great campus reporting. So those nexuses are super important. Connecting, I think, to local Palestinian families and communities is really a great addition to that work. So yeah, local activists, look at what JVP is doing in your town, for example, and other organizations, campus politics, local politics. Thank you for your work. It's really, really important.
So quickly, I agree with Amal, and also connected with solidarity groups, including Black Lives Matter and other groups that with whom Palestine resonates. And so, because Palestine is no longer just a Palestine issue, it's a global issue. It's a human issue for all humanity. But I think that my advice would be just to tell the human story. I really think that's important. If you can manage to speak to students who are affected, or students who want to talk about their feelings, is just to go and speak to them and talk about it and write about it. So I think this type of reporting where you have to be uh, neutral and objective and so on just doesn't make sense in this particular situation. There needs to be activist intervention, and I tend to think about journalism, good journalism at this particular moment has to be an activist intervention type of journalism, because otherwise it doesn't make any difference.
Can I add something? Sorry, Bassam, you're muted.
Were you able to hear the question? It's a journalist, young journalist. Okay.
Actually, I had to step away so I can pick up a copy of a student newspaper. This is from the Peak, which is SFU, my university's newspaper, and right here on the cover, the entire issue is dedicated to Palestine activism. And
Wow.
while I don't know any of the reporters or the editors, but literally at least half the issue is dedicated to Palestine. This is the second issue in a row. The last one was a full page of the front cover was the entire Palestinian flag. And that's it, with no title, with no headline. So all this to say that, and some of it is, recipes for Mujaddara out of solidarity, and stories from people, and sometimes anonymous students writing, articles in here, reporting on local governance and local government's responses to the Israeli attack on Gaza. So all this to say, I think it's critical to be, if you're in a position where you're capable of seeing the work that you're doing in print, or to have it see the light of day, then in that case, pushing the boundaries is absolutely necessary. As Dina said, this is a critical juncture in human history. We'll look back and think of where we were, what we were doing, what we said, what we didn't say is gonna loom much larger and be louder than words. But also thinking outside the box. Sometimes it is, in addition to what Dina said, which is like the real stories, the relatable stories, of which there are literally thousands, thousands and thousands of stories worth telling. Children, women, and men, uh, innocent human beings. They're also in every community. We are all at least one degree of separation from someone who's lost their life or lost a loved one in Gaza, or is suffering in one way or another. So those stories are very relatable, and they are in your local community. The local community is also where Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs and Middle Easterners and Jewish people of conscience are mourning and upset. Talk to them, reach out to those communities. Their testimonies, their anecdotes, their experiences are absolutely vital, and they're very relatable. So, for example, I'm reading a lot of really fantastic Hanukkah stories about how difficult it is for lots of Jews of conscience to go through this period, and how it's forcing really important conversations. And then lastly, I would say poetry, as both Dina and Amal said. And if you don't mind, in honor of Rifat Al, I just want to take a second to kind of read his very last poem. He was killed in an Israeli strike to yesterday, and with his family. And in the 2014 war, he also lost family members there. So this is a poem called "Drenched," and it's Rifat Lari's last poem. On the shores of the Mediterranean, I saw humanity drenched in salt, face down, dead, eyes gouged, hands up to the sky, praying, or trembling in fear. I could not tell. The sea, harsher than the heart of an Arab, dances, soaked with blood. Only the pebbles wept, only the pebbles. All the perfumes of Arabia will not grace the rot Israel breeds.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
may his soul rest, him and over 17,000 Palestinians killed, rest in power and peace.
Thank you. I know it's really time to break, but the thing is that we have so many questions, so I will not be able to ask them. I would like to ask you now in public. Uh, Maybe we can continue at another time, but I have one question that I'd like to ask. Is that okay? Like, to sort of one last question, and that is, it's about a deadly matter, and that is how this conflict has been the deadliest in terms of journalists being killed and targeted since the Committee to Protect Journalists was found. Some say more journalists have been killed in Gaza over just 50 days than the entirety of the Second World War, and now we're at, we're way beyond 50 days. What does that do to reporting of the conflict, and does it silence the media or galvanize it to report on the targeting of its own staff and peers? And we've seen on CNN, and I'm not going to get polemical here, but a particular announcer who was always giving the Israeli narrative almost 100% benefit of the doubt, and has been actually critiqued widely for this, sort of switched 180 degrees in one of the reports when one of the with the family of one of the reporters were killed, and so on. And so do this fact of targeting journalists, does it change things? Is it going to change things in future conflicts? And I will tag to this the last word question. So I was going to ask a last word question, and I'll tag it on because it's connected. And that's a question that I ask a lot of people. This morning we had a mini workshop, and I asked the same question as well, and that is, do you see that this particular conflict, and I'm talking about the political dimensions and the military dimensions and the humanitarian dimensions, and now the media dimension, do you see that there may be uh, not a tectonic shift, but a fundamental shift after this conflict compared to before this conflict in terms of media reporting and the way media deals with conflict? Or is it just the Palestine exception that is going to sort of, you know, fade away and then things go back to normal? Or will this experience affect the way we cover, portray, and report in the future? So these two questions together, if you don't mind, and then we will release you into your weekend.
Well, I'll start briefly then. And I really want to thank Adel for reading that poem. I had another poem of his queued up, and so I'm very, very grateful to have his presence with us today. In terms of, what does this so incredibly deadly conflict for journalists mean for reporting? Yeah, I think there are probably those moments of resonance and connection. But I do think also kind of building on what Adel has said that, well, the big problem is that, I mean, actually, European and American journalists are not at all at risk from this right now, right? And so they're completely isolated because they are not going into Gaza, right? So I think that sort of that identification with the threat and the killing is sort of diminished because they can continue to feel isolated. I do remember after 9/11, I made a brief documentary. A journalist named Mazen Dana, a Palestinian journalist and cameraman who was from Hebron, was receiving a Press Freedom Award, and it was really remarkable that he was receiving it because he was a camera person, and usually, those awards go to like the editor or something like this, right? But he came and he went to what was then the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in D.C. to receive this award, and he got this incredible standing ovation from everybody in the room, after they'd been seeing him being like beaten by settlers and shot by soldiers and all of this stuff in the video that was brought in. And later, the director of CPJ said, look, this is quite a time for journalists because American journalists know that this was in November of 2000. I hope that journalists feel viscerally what it means for journalists to lose their lives and for their families to lose their lives. And I'm sure that many of them do. But I do think that the fact that they're not in Gaza isolates them a little bit. Do I see this fundamentally shifting coverage? Perhaps. One thing that I've been interested in is that there is sort of some coverage in some of the media about what's going on, for example, in the West Bank and settler violence and the ongoing actually dispossession of Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Like in some ways, I'm glad that that is arriving in the news as much as it is. Like that this is being covered as this political war on all Palestinians, right? So I think we're going to have to see, this is going to be a crisis of every single kind, right? More journalists have been killed, more children, as the number of children killed is immense and hard to conceive of. Every category of people is being hurt, and we know this is going to be a public health disaster. So I think kind of everybody's going to need to jump on board with all their expertise, whether you're a public health person or if Israel floods the tunnels, it becomes an environmental, and already is an environmental crisis. A crisis for children, for education. I mean, everybody has to jump on board to look at the multifaceted dimensions of the harm and destruction that is being imposed upon Gaza now by Israel.
So briefly on the question of whether the killing of the journalists is changing, obviously it's a question of who is being killed, and the sad thing about this is that at least 80 to 90% of the journalists killed are Palestinians. So again, there will be, which life matters. Is it a journalist who's Palestinian who dies? There is no fuss about it. So you remember when Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, the only response started to come out is because the label, she's Palestinian American or American Palestinian or whatever. So in a sense, it doesn't get covered enough. So it becomes like a number, and it's exactly like the number of Palestinians killed. These children, they don't have names, they don't have a history, they don't have anything. But I do feel that maybe some of the Western journals are very much affected by this. So whether that will come out in the future, we will have to wait and see. In terms of how it's going to change, I think the the genocide against Gaza is such a monumental event. It's very hard for us to think beyond the present. To sort of people are thinking, okay, the future. What is the future plan? What is the end plan? Gaza itself. And today, we heard the term, what is it, domicide, which is the destruction of whole city, whole buildings. So there is memoricide, there's genocide, there's domicide. So it's impossible, somehow the brain cannot function and think how people are going to rebuild their lives, what is going to happen, what at the basis of the everyday. How are people going to pick up the remains and be able to live, and so on? But people talk a lot about Palestinian resilience, but I will remind you of a fantastic video that went viral online, which is a Palestinian student, and I think you must have seen it, where people were asking her, "Are you okay?" And she started shouting to say, "No, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. I'm not okay." People, and this is the situation. We are not okay. We're trying. So we can't really think about what is going to happen. I'm sorry that I don't have an answer to that question.
I'm gonna try. Thank you, Amahl and Dina. There's not much really that I can add to what you said, but um, I will suggest that I think the problem here is that if you follow Israeli, the way is the Israeli government and Israeli Defense Forces discuss this issue of the death of the killing of Palestinian journalists in Gaza, their response is that they are not journalists. I mean,
Mhm.
initially they were never civilians, but they were also never journalists. So what it means is um, every I mean that these journalists are either advocating for something or that they're committed to a cause of some sort, which negates their objectivity. Whereas Israeli reporters and every other reporter is allowed to be a human in their body and be present in a place and to retell their stories and narrate their community's experiences, Palestinian reporters cannot. Um, it is only in instances where Palestinian journalists work with or for Western news organizations that they become worthy of sympathy by association. And I think that is the fundamental problem. And that is why CNN can relate that way. Because, these I mean, and for the most part, every news organization in the West, because of dwindling budgets, has to rely on stringers and freelancers and locally engaged staff to do all of their quote unquote dirty work and to do it in extremely high risk in the process, so they don't have to deal with liabilities and insurance if things come up. So these people are on the front line. They're considered native to that territory, which means that they are considered non-credible. But for the most part, when need be, they are turned to for verification, for details, and then the content that they produce ends up going through editing filters before it actually makes its way on air. So the reporters who are connected to these Western media organizations are themselves being censored, despite producing content domestically, being told that their realities are inconsistent with the way we see the world, the way we wish to report the conflict that they're in and the experiences that they're relaying. So while I'm joyed, but as if there's any joy in this, I'm joyed to see that there is some humanity in some of the anchors and reporters on CNN, but it begs the question of how many other journalists do they have no connection with? I mean, when Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, while there was solidarity and support among journalists, there was the big question of why was she there? Who does she work for? Al Jazeera is politically problematic. Whatever, all those different sort of um, articulations. So I would say that it has a lot to do with cultural proximity and the extent to which people are prepared to make that humanistic leap to acknowledge the worthiness of others. And I hope that journalists are starting to make that journey, each in their own way. I do know that a lot of journalists, mainstream Western journalists, many of whom have no connection to the Middle East, are themselves struggling with the reporting because either they're being blocked by their own institutions, or they're afraid of taking certain measures, or but many of them are also know that actually I've heard this from numerous reporters where they've produced content, but the content has never either gone to air, never been published, which is an indication that there's labor being extracted and it's not really materializing. So there's a lot of frustration within these news organizations. I hope that with this very very hefty loss to the journalistic establishment of so many remarkable professionals in Gaza, that there is that recognition of their collective humanity. On the second question that you posed, Bassam, about whether or not this is a major transformation, I think if there's a turn, it's actually a cultural turn. It's neither a political turn nor is it anything else. I think it's a cultural turn in the sense that um, it's going to be very difficult to roll back what's already unfolded because you can't unsee what you've seen. If you've encountered what Israel has done, if you've seen the raw footage, it's difficult to roll that back. And I think that has will have repercussions moving forward in the next 5, 10, 15 years as the student organizers at protests today become the employees of the future and then take up positions in other places. Also, we've not talked about, and of course there's very limited time to discuss this, but the mutinies that are unfolding within public and private institutions where people are protesting and rising up to say, I'm sorry, the ethos of this institution doesn't reflect the way in which I see the world. So I think there is a generational cultural turn that's unfolding, and it has a lot to do with where people are accessing information, what information they find reliable, and how they use this information, and the increasing courage with which they're prepared to share this information. And I would say the last thing that I would add in that respect is also how incredibly catastrophic Israel's media campaign has been, in the sense that it has been really slipshod, very poorly articulated. While it seems sophisticated in the Hasbara kind of circles, but when you look at Israeli social media and what
Mm.
soldiers are posting, it is so incredibly incriminating. Like dancing you know, on the destroyed buildings of Palestinians, like sifting through their belongings, um, celebrating death and destruction, putting flags over territory and claiming it for Israel. The arguments against, that this is a settler colonial project are debunked specifically by the Israeli soldiers, not by Palestinian voices or anyone else. So I would say that for the long term, there's hundreds of thousands of videographic content that will be damning for many, many years to come in a way that Israel will have a hard time refuting. But then again, maybe I'm being an optimist. I just, at this moment, it feels to me like there's a seismic shift and that there's an isolation of the voices that support the status quo. In the same way that when you look at the General Assembly of the United Nations, only 4 countries vote against the UNRWA resolution. In the case of the Security Council, only one veto. Everybody else is on the other side. So it's, I think the fault lines are becoming much more clear.
Thank you all. I only had 6 more questions to ask, and I will not ask them. One of them was, let's just like fantasize. One of them was on the question of echo chambers and social media, which you sort of addressed, but I wanted to ask more pointed questions as to what benefits anyone if we're all talking to our own. But perhaps we can have another conversation. We have abused you beyond what we promised, so I apologize for that. Thank you all for your dedication and your work, and for making the time to join us on Friday afternoon or Friday evening for Dina and Amal. I'm not sure. Um, so I really appreciate all of your commitment and readiness to join us. I would also like to thank everybody who has been following us and everyone who's been downloading, uploading, assigning, sharing. We have had a tremendous set of communication coming towards us about these series, and we are working on curating a lot of these teach-ins in order to make them available in more manageable form, because some of these teach-ins are pretty long, so we're segmenting everything, we're placing them during the holidays, and perhaps a little before, on palestineandcontext.org. So they are ready to use for lay people and educators, journalists, and everyone who's interested in looking back. We're also very excited about our podcast, War on Palestine, which was being produced twice or three times a week. And now it's produced once or twice a week, because so much of the foundations of the conflict had been covered in the early period. Please check all of this out at palestiniancontext.org. And again, Dina Matar and Amal Bishara and Adel Iskandar, thank you so much. I hope that there are better days ahead. I don't think there will be, especially in the next 2 weeks, because based on the clock that we are following, the military clock and the killing clock, it looks like that's a window that's been sort of given. And I think that it will be used and abused before any sort of reduction in hostilities and killing take place. So let's brace for impact, stay safe, and we will hopefully see you another time. Thank you all so much.